La diffusion vient de démarrer. Tous les participants sont en mode écoute seul.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Fleet Europe webinar about how to make an international fleet management strategy applicable and practicable. The information shared within this Fleet Europe webinar is subject to disclaimers which can be viewed in detail via the recording of this session, which will be shared on our website fleeteurope.com. Since years, international fleet management is the trend. Why? Because it can deliver harmonization, process optimization, and cost efficiency, at least if that is done in the right way. And one of the conditions for successful international fleet management is, of course, also being aware of local specifics. Indeed, international fleet managers have pointed out that both local market realities and local stakeholder resistance are two key obstacles when taking your fleet program to an international level. And that's why we believe that the topic of today's webinar is really valuable for you international fleet managers. We are happy that we from Fleet Europe do not have to detail this topic all alone this afternoon. To give insight in how to balance international versus local and stay successful, we have found the support of TraXall International. Today's speakers are two true experts. We have among us Ross Jackson, Chief Executive Officer of TraXall International, and Thibaut Didier, Chief Operating Officer at TraXall International. If everything is fine, then normally Ross Jackson and Thibaut Didier are in this webinar room, and I think, Ross, that you are going to start with explaining the topic of today's webinar.
I am indeed. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Stephen. So I'm conscious, firstly, that some of you won't know much about TraXall International. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes very quickly explaining who we are and what we do. For those of you that don't know, TraXall is a multi-market fleet management organization, and we sit absolutely on the client side. So we don't represent the fleet industry, we represent you and your business as a trusted advisor and a business process outsourcing partner. Our job is to support you and to get your strategies working, and our long-term role to support increased efficiency, enhance service, reduce costs, of course, and to enable and manage change whilst ensuring satisfaction amongst your people and your stakeholders. TraXall becomes an extension of your business. We accelerate success, we manage the administration and the supply chain where appropriate, we remove complexity, give stakeholders confidence at every level, and we're here to keep your people delighted with our service. If I talk about the markets, data consolidation aside, which we can manage for any country in the world, TraXall operates extensively throughout the UK, Europe, and Latin America. We deliver our fleet management services in markets where we have a physical presence, and we firmly believe that the physical presence is essential in this particular service industry space because it isn't possible to deliver service as efficiently or as effectively from a hub-based system. And while I'm at it, I'll touch on IT and systems for a moment because our systems are specifically and deliberately tailor-made to support each market in which we operate. And that's essential to ensure a perfect fit and an understanding of how a local business operates in a local market every time. So that's something that isn't possible with a top-down single system architecture structure. Our clients indeed are frequently impressed with how flexible and accommodating our systems are, but back to the markets, as a client-led organization, we continue to look for opportunities to enter new markets, and we're firmly focused on following our clients to where the needs actually are. Finally, let me give you some quick details of TraXall's scale. Today we have 280 clients in multiple markets, managed by 249 highly trained and experienced colleagues. We're managing over 168,000 vehicles in these markets, or to put it another way, we're responsible for the management of 1.2 billion euros of annual client spend across over 4 billion euros of assets.
So indeed, let's now address the topic itself. Now, what we've noticed over and over again is that the first idea that comes up to the mind of international category managers when they're investigating the potential of a pan-European fleet project is typically to go for a sole leasing supplier. Now, probably this is driven by experiences in other categories where aggregating volume automatically leads to some savings. So typically they start immediately by sending a very complex RFQ towards usually the 2 to 3 major international leasing companies, while promising also that they probably could evolve towards a 100% coverage of their fleet. Now, usually this RFQ is completely focused on volume savings, even more. What we see is that they often try to obtain a kind of large check, an upfront kind of check, just to so-called ensure the future savings. Now, unfortunately, in reality, the cost drivers are not exactly comparable to other commodities, where I guess volume does have a major impact. But of course, we're talking the fleet domain here, and in the fleet domain, it's typically about the potential, which is the driver of the leasing codes. Now, what's even worse is that they often forget to take the local complexity or even the local inertia into account, which also have a serious impact on the final cost. So usually as a result, this RFQ does not take into account all those local specifics, not externally, but not even internally, which actually results in a situation where the local stakeholders often even fight the RFQ and usually they do that with very, very serious arguments. Typically, it often starts with lots of mistakes in the comparisons themselves. Let me just give you a real life example. At one of our clients, a very, very large fleet, procurement consultants thought they could get at least 30% savings versus the 4-company multi-bid situation just on the pure leasing financing part itself. Keep in mind that it was a really large client, which obviously had already incredible good discounts on the investment side, and obviously also because of those 4 multi-bid situation, extremely good residual values either. So 30% saving just on that part. Now, anyone with some common sense could immediately have seen that that's nearly impossible. And yeah, of course, when we went into detail, they had made some obvious mistakes. Typically, they had made a comparison on 80,000 kilometers on 4 years, where the reality was about 140,000 kilometers, 3.5 years. Or they had forgotten to take into account the options, which obviously have another situation on another impact on residual value. And finally, they had even forgotten to take into account the fact that people could pay for themselves for extra options, which is not a company cost, of course. So I can assure you that as a result, when they had to present this case to the VPHR, the procurement director really had some awkward moments, as obviously when we made some quick calculations and analysis, and it revealed that only on some cases there was a little bit of saving, but only in the area of 2 to 3%, while in most cases it was even more expensive. So what came out very quickly is that the proposed check by that leasing company in reality would be compensated in less than 1.5 years or even nearly 1 year by higher costs. So obviously it was rejected. So I guess you really understand why we really advocate the multi-source strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Thibaut. Interesting points. I'm just going to elaborate further on one of the points you made, along with some additional and relevant considerations for our audience. Many corporates today, as Thibaut said, are tempted by what can appear to be generous golden hellos, loyalty bonuses, signing on payments, prebates, call them what you will. But the reality is simple. There is no such thing as free money. And I know of no bank-owned or shareholder-owned organization in the world that's going to say to anybody, whether they're an individual or corporate, hey, here's 2 million euros because you're going to work exclusively with us. Heck, have 3 million euros instead. And we don't want any of it back, ever. And no, of course, there's no interest and no catch. Really? If anyone listening to this conversation knows of such a bank, please send me an email after this webinar, because I'd love to know them. And let's just examine that word exclusively for a moment. These payments that the industry is making today are somewhat contentious and are attractive, of course, to some organizations, but it is in return for exclusivity. Now, as you can see on the screen, we've carried out extensive analysis of just over 92,000 vehicle orders placed through our business during the last 3 years. This analysis relates mainly to cars, but also to light commercial vehicles, and it covered multiple European markets. And finally, the analysis related to a defined competing environment, so one in which normally a maximum of 2, 3, maybe 4 leasing companies at most per customer existed, in which orders can only be won on merit, so they're not won by virtue of a sole supply agreement or undertaking. Frankly, the results are staggering. In not one market across multiple European countries did any single leasing organization win more than 45% of the available orders at any time in the 3-year period. In sole supply, of course, it's an exclusive scenario, and each leasing company would in fact have received or gained 100% of the orders. But the evidence on the basis of our analysis clearly suggests that those customers would perhaps have paid too much for at least 55% of the vehicles ordered, and perhaps substantially more. And let's also be clear here that some of the deltas we're talking about are significant deltas between the competing businesses. Before I end on this point, let's be clear, of course. This isn't the fault of the leasing companies per se. And in fact, of course, if we were running a leasing company, we would also want to pick up all of our clients' business, and we would do everything possible in our power to make sure we did that. But as most of you know, and particularly with the European closed-end leasing arrangements, there are just too many moving parts, as Thibaut alluded to before, and too many options to effectively pin down and control pricing from a customer perspective. And to name a few, you have differing interest rates, differing and frequently changing views on residual values, maintenance budgets, profit margin, overheads, management fees, profit recovery, and so the list and complexity goes on. But also, and a real issue for many fleets now and for the next few years, are the differing concerns about the impact of growing unpopularity with diesel. For the purposes of this conversation, let's call it Dieselgate. And already we're starting to see the beginning of progressively increased personal taxation in some markets, and we will continue without doubt to see deterioration in residual values. And the thing is that no one really knows how quickly it will happen or how bad it will get. But each leasing company, of course, will have a different outlook, a different stance, a different exposure to risk, and that will polarize further pricing strategies and changes. So I ask you one question: is now really the right time to have all your eggs in one basket? I would suggest not. And don't also forget that all these variables, including Dieselgate, will apply in every country in which your business is represented, so every market where you're operating, and it will become almost impossible then to track whether or not you originally made the right financial decision at the point of tender. Our evidence and experience clearly supports that continuous competition is the only truly effective mechanism to control lease costs. Multi-supply, done right, is just as light touch and feels just like sole supply. But the key difference is that it delivers continuous competition, resulting in significant and sustainable cost savings.
Indeed, Ross. Now, as Stephen has already said in his introduction, Europe is really a complex market with different tax regimes, different cultures. And by the way, our US colleagues are frequently amazed and sometimes even horrified at just how complex Europe actually is. It's true, isn't it? I mean, Europe is not a country. It's a collection of different countries and economies, each with their own take on what fleet is and how it operates. Vehicles can be provided on need or a status basis. And what we see is that a growing number of organizations in different countries, not all of them, but in some countries, offer cash allowances or the other way around. They offer a salary sacrifice or even mobility allowances to the complete employee base. But it's all inspired by different reasons and usually by different tax environments. So on the one hand, we have really no doubt that this will continue. It will continue to evolve, and there will be probably some harmonization in some areas over time, probably most notably around CO2, of course, and and the treatment around that, the taxation of pollutants, etc. But again, it's in our opinion, it's not for the immediate future, the harmonization, I mean. On the other hand, mobility, however that's finally defined, will continue to increase in popularity and importance over time. And what we'll see is that there will be changing models as this evolves. But again, we must recognize that for many organizations and countries, mobility still is a kind of concept, and it also remains embryonic. So in some way, I think you should keep it under review. We do, by the way. But in a market at a point of time, it will become practical, it will become relevant, but not exactly immediately at the moment. But you should keep it in review. But let's be clear. The elephant in the room, as people say, with any global multi-market strategy is this. Local operations or local people, they simply don't like being told what to do by anyone else, and they can even resent head office interference. It really doesn't matter whether that's HR, procurement, country leadership, whatever, or even service users. It's a fact. Face it, no one of us like being told what to do. So engagement from the outset is really, really absolutely critical to success. So taking that into account, we believe there are 3, and only 3, main focus areas. Procurement, of course, human resources, comp and ben, and let's say what we are calling local organizational focus. So for the rest of this webinar, this is the 3 areas where we are going to focus upon.
So while a globally sourcing strategy is typically designed to consolidate the supply chain to achieve maximum leverage and the fewest possible points of contact, does this mean it's right for every market? Should it be a guiding principle or should it be an absolute requirement? And if this is an absolute requirement, let's then just take a step back and reevaluate why. What is it we're trying to achieve in these situations? Well, our view, and indeed our experience of many such situations, is that organizations are trying to achieve cost reduction and data simplicity with the lowest common denominator, often the power of one, i.e., as we've already said, one global leasing company. But we've yet to see a situation where that brings either pricing parity or consistently the best pricing on every vehicle in every market. So taking aside data and the single point of contact simplicity, what's really happening here is that this style of simplicity comes at a price, and often a price that increases over time, so the delta between tender pricing, market pricing, and actual pricing paid continues to deteriorate. We also have to recognize that some markets have very capable and price-efficient local heroes. So at international level, are we considering ruling them out? And if so, why? What good does it do other than to fit in with a corporate plan? And if we're honest, if the data provided from such local heroes can integrate into our global data feeds, and our local stakeholders are being well looked after, and our local business is important to the supplier, especially against a backdrop where the international sole supply deal might actually cost the local business more, then why are we really bothered about it? Because actually at international level, surely what we want is the strategy working, we want the control, we want the markets happy, and we want the data in a consolidated form that we can actually act upon and understand. So we should acknowledge that often local markets can have a good deal, and that's in the local and overall corporate good, and therefore keeping those local stakeholders happy. And as a result, perhaps we should think about picking our fights carefully and not get too drawn into a single supplier utopia. Let's also consider that leasing is also not the best option for every market. As an example, we have one very cash-rich client at the moment who leases vehicles in most markets, but in one market, the local business continues to purchase vehicles outright. Why? Well, simply because every time they analyze the lease versus buy financial scenario, with detailed analysis of cash, taxation, cost of funds, and so on, buying saves them the best part of €1 million a year. And yet they remain under corporate pressure to lease. And that's simply because it's what happens everywhere else, and it fits neatly into a plan or a strategy. This, of course, isn't uncommon, but when individuals' performance bonuses are linked to certain metrics and outcomes, sometimes common sense goes out of the window, and a corporate entity will pat itself on the back and unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, pay more just to fit everybody into the same neat box.
Yeah, Ross, and if I even may add to that, of course, there are some cost elements that do benefit from pan-European harmonization or a pan-European negotiation. Now, but to define what can be brought on an international level, one has really to clearly identify the cost drivers. Let me just give you some examples. Typically, a potential international category could obviously be the bundling of brand choices, but keep in mind, it might have a policy impact, and therefore it can be disastrous from an HR point of view in some countries. Another one, regional bundling of fuel providers. Obviously, that could result in extra discounts, but again, the spread of the gas stations has a major impact on the number of miles driven. And not at least the fact if it's not close enough, the spread, it can be perceived as a serious downturn in service. Another one, bundling of insurance policies. That's an interesting one, but as obviously insurance coverage can be optimized by having a larger number of cars. Of course, you get a better statistical spread that way. But also keep in mind that someone has to do the accident management. It's not free either, so you have to take that into account as well. Even leasing contracts might be looked at on a multi-country level, although we notice a clear tendency amongst our clients that evolve towards a multi-bit approach. What we see actually is that nearly all larger corporations tend to that kind of multi-bit environment. This can also be the closest alternative, of course, to a single source approach, where one of the pan-European leaders has been chosen, but always challenged by at least one local hero, as Ross explained, the so-called runner-up. Now, that of course ensures the pan-European company to remain sharp, and it's forced to continuously deliver sharp pricing. But what we should not forget, of course, is that in a multi-bit environment, it's always very important to be able to really compare apples for apples. So the process should absolutely ensure that all players abide to the same rules and the same contractual terms. I'm talking KPIs, contract elements, etc. Now, another reason why companies prefer this approach is that it keeps the possibility open, so it's an option if you want to. It keeps the possibility open to easily replace the supplier, even the pan-European one, by another supplier, but only in those countries where it's necessary, where it's appropriate. That avoids, of course, that you have to redo the full pan-European project, and it enables you to adjust just there within the problem scope. We've seen even companies that go that far that they even force some players to be, let's say, sitting on a waiting bench for some time, just to keep them in the possibility to replace the current supplier by this one. That's a far stretch, but okay, it happens. Now, next to the procurement wish list, maybe if we can have the next slide. Yeah. So next to the procurement wish list, typically HR also wants a seat at the table. Let's not forget why we give company cars. In some cases, there will be a clear functional reason, typically a salesperson, a technician, or whatever. But in many cases, it's either purely salary driven, or at least it has some extra, let's call it, attraction impact. Definitely for the salespeople it has. Now, what we've noticed is that this element usually is not considered well enough in the international strategies. In our opinion, you should not let the procurement define which brands or models can be reached, or at least not alone. I think you always should start from the motive. Which type of cars do you want to provide, and only then start negotiating. For some reason, people tend to believe that they will be able to offer better cars and therefore first await the negotiation results and only then define the types and the models they want to offer. Now, usually this is a real failure. Typically, the choice of cars is mainly cultural driven. You should not forget, it's really very important to take into equation how people perceive the brands and the models from a tax point of view, and that's different country by country. Again, let me give a typical example. Some brands do not always consider a small country like Belgium, big enough a market to modify their CO2 output to match the better tax level. Now, you can imagine what happens then if you have negotiated a great deal with that specific manufacturer, well, I guess you will only find very, very unhappy HR people in that country. The third element you should look at is what we call the organizational focus. By that, we not only mean how the cars are managed and handled from a purely technical perspective, but also you should look at the internal approval and management flows. Again, what we often encounter is that an RFP is aimed mainly on the service elements, the technical service elements, so directly related to the car, the asset itself, but it does not take into account enough the procedures and processes of the internal fleet management. Now, what you have then is that this results in suddenly having either no one doing the fleet management, which is obviously not an ideal situation, or alternatively, having the local stakeholders having to pick it up again and again, very, very unhappy with your process. Another element on the let's say on the organizational focus is obviously reporting, as Ross already mentioned that. But of course, reporting is also such a generic concept that it does not always answer to the needs. Let's keep in mind that someone also has to analyze and understand the specific context and nuances. What's exactly included in which element, etc. What we've seen often is that, the simple concept of garbage in, garbage out. You get some information, but it's so bundled that you cannot really compare. So comparison not possible. Another very important concern about reporting, and that's really too often overlooked, that for practical and local needs, it also has to include the legacy fleet, something often forgotten. Often leasing companies are able to deliver a more or less uniform reporting all over the countries, but only over their own fleet, but nothing on the legacy fleet, which obviously is a major part when you start. And thirdly, what is also very important to keep in mind is that often local heroes are far better developed in delivering the right automated accounting files. It's really not an easy task. Let's face it. It's not an easy task to deliver one exact file for all countries if you do not have the knowledge on the local legal differences. So keep also in mind that many pan-European leasing companies are actually using different local systems themselves. Not all of them, but some are. And the reason why they do that is exactly to cover these local differences. So you might end up then aggregating with less accuracy accounting files that actually were already well enough for the local needs. And finally, to make it even worse, in many organizations, accounting is kept by a shared service center somewhere near shore. It's usually a very complex process to set up. So do put a lot of emphasis in getting it done and understood by all stakeholders, not just local, but also that shared service center.
So what we've really covered today is really a global strategy, but the execution of local delivery. And if I can recap on some points, really, the effective delivery of a global strategy really is dependent upon its adoption by the country business units, which Thibaut's already covered in terms of these core areas of consideration on the previous slides. We have extensive experience of working with fleets across multiple markets, and I guess our steps for success are as follows. Number one, you need to design a strategy that meets procurement, human resources, CSR, health and safety, and overall organizational objectives. It's vital that you set up a cross-functional team with country representation so that you better understand their concerns and the market, and also so that the people from those markets feel engaged and listened to. These people, if you approach this correctly, will convince local management that your strategy is a good idea. Then you need to identify these specific local needs for every area and identify the differences between the countries so that they're clearly mapped out and clearly understood. Consider how your global strategy can be adapted to work locally. So with local suppliers, for example, and if there is strong opinion and it meets your overall cost and data objectives, why not support your local stakeholders to negotiate locally, but within the internationally agreed boundaries and guidelines? They can help you do your work with local representatives of manufacturers, OEMs, leasing companies, fleet management companies, etc. And it is absolutely possible to have local variations and local suppliers working very effectively within, and in fact, even enhancing a global strategy. Then consider how best to implement your strategy and how you future-proof strategic directional changes. Your country businesses need to be well looked after. They're the ones, after all, who have to deal with the operational elements of this, as opposed to just setting strategy. They want to know that they're listened to, as I've already said, and they want good pricing. They also, of course, want good service. But an often overlooked point is that they don't want the hassle of changing suppliers in a few years, and let's face it, none of us do. But if they had to do that, they then have to re-implement all the contact points, all the data exchanges, build new relationships, worry about managing in particular the legacy fleets and so on. And whilst the international leasing companies are now launching various reporting and consolidation tools onto the marketplace, they're not actually doing anything to historically manage legacy fleets. They're just providing you with a portal in which you can input some data. So don't underestimate the sheer amount of work that has to be operationally carried out in each local business when strategy or suppliers change. One way around this, of course, is to consider engaging early on an organization such as ourselves, where we can speed up strategic delivery and where we know how to support multiple countries with effective fleet management. Organizations like us sit on the side of the customer, as I said at the beginning of this webinar, and their job is to embed themselves into your local businesses and to support your stakeholders, translating your vision into a strategy that actually works for you and the local stakeholders. Further, a company like TraXall, which should critically have systems that are built specifically to serve each local market, rather than inflexible systems that serve a single global market, each need to feed into a consolidated global reporting system with people who know the details of each country market. So an organization like TraXall becomes in fact a strategic delivery platform with the ability to manage the legacy fleets, report on them as well, of course, but also single or multi-supply leased fleets, and even in some markets purchased fleets. So you get meaningful local and global reporting data in a consolidated view, but critically again with full management, not just a reporting system, on every vehicle that you operate. Models like this deliver a consistent operating platform, and whatever the strategic direction becomes, or however often it changes, as a BPO management organization, our people and our systems are there to smooth any changes and translate those same changes into the same familiar reports for the same people in your same markets at the same time. Not forgetting, of course, the same positive consistency and familiarity around the driver's service. A good strategy should be capable of change and evolution. It shouldn't be blocked by local resistance and concern of changing suppliers, or indeed of adding complexity. We exist to enable change, to minimize disruption, to maximize efficiency, and to bring clarity to otherwise confusing business communication processes. Above all, we remain the consistent part of the strategy, the business as usual bit that looks after your people and your stakeholders under an environment that everyone is familiar with and happy with. Our job is to deliver and support you in making sure not only your strategy is successful, but the implementation programs are also successful and bring lasting satisfaction and success.
So as a conclusion, despite that probably everyone amongst you will fully agree upon what we've told you about the three main focus areas, and first getting the local stakeholders involved, we still see so many international strategies fail, just because not taking these basic rules into account. And yeah, I know our approach really doesn't seem rocket science, and in fairness, it isn't. But why is it that fleet professionals do overlook so many local hurdles? I guess it's probably because they just mingle a little bit too much the three areas instead of clearly identifying the local differences and local needs per area, of course. And yes, as a final takeaway, yes, of course, we are all Europeans, but that does not mean we do understand the full 100% of each market. 85% indeed is very alike, or even completely alike, but 15% isn't. And that's the point. The devil always is in the details. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ross and Thibault, thank you for explaining the topic. I can imagine that our participants, they have some questions for both of you. So the participants that have a question, they can use the chat function of this webinar tool. And so we will open now the little Q&A together with our expert speakers. First question is related to, let's say, the introduction that you gave about your company. You were pointing out that, let's say, you stress the importance of giving information, managing fleets in those countries where you also have a presence. But you are not present, of course, in every country. Does that mean that for all other countries, people can't rely on your company?
No, Stephen, I guess it doesn't really mean that. What it means is, so I suppose there's two parts to this question. Firstly, people can rely on us, of course, whatever we do, because we're hugely reliable. But actually what you're asking is can we look after people in markets where we aren't present? Today, the answer is simply no. It's a deliberate strategy from our side. We can, of course, consolidate data and oversee things at a remote level, but we prefer to deliver our services in the market when we actually have people and offices in those markets. The reason for that is because you have to know and understand the local market. You have to be able to operate successfully within it. You need to know how to get things done. You need to intuitively understand the tax regimes and also the obstacles and barriers that actually exist to different levels in every market in which an organization operates. So, as I said earlier, we're market-led in terms of, we're client-led in terms of the markets we're opening up in. And we continue to look at new markets. We're an expanding organization. We will continue to expand, and hopefully today we cover pretty much all of Europe and certainly parts of Latin America, and it's growing and will continue to grow.
Mm-hmm. A question also related to your company is straightforward. Do you really manage international fleets on an operational level as well?
Maybe just sorry, Ross. Maybe just yes, we do manage fleets on an operational level, but the question is, what exactly do you mean by operational level? As Ross explained, we are a BPO organization, business process outsourcing. So we take over the full process, the internal process, and we bolt on whatever supplier that fits that specific need of that specific client in that specific market. So actually what we do is we make sure that the process is managed. That does not mean that we replace a leasing company, just to be clear.
Okay. Another question is related to some of the trends that we see in the global marketplace. Companies are disappearing, companies are getting acquired by other companies. How would you, with your knowledge and expertise, approach merging two legacy fleets globally?
So I'll take this one, Thibault. It's something that we see happening all the time. So consolidation, mergers and acquisitions, of course, is not only happening in the corporate world that we're talking about, but is also happening within the leasing world. But looking at it from a client perspective, we do this in multiple different ways. Firstly, all our systems are configured with client data and specifically vehicle data, which we move into a globally operated reporting tool so we can see at a glance exactly what's happening in any market at any point in time. But critically, it's about giving the local operators the ability to merge these fleets and to look at them as a single fleet. And that's probably one of the unique aspects of what our organization does. We look at every single vehicle from day one. So where we're engaged by an organization, we take over the management of all vehicles at that point in time. As Thibault said, that doesn't mean we're replacing leasing companies, but what it does mean is that we're taking responsibility for, where appropriate, driver contact, strategy, delivery, vehicle ordering, vehicle replacements, and all the operational elements that actually make a difference. But that unique and critical point I made is that we look at everything in the same way. So it doesn't matter whether that's a new vehicle or a legacy vehicle, or indeed where organizations have gone through multiple acquisitions or indeed multiple strategy changes. It could actually be 5, 6, 7, 8 different suppliers or more in one market, magnified, of course, by the number of markets in which the client operates. So something we're very used to, Stephen. We do it all the time.
Okay. Another question is, during the webinar, you stressed out that there can be some value in having, let's say, multiple leasing companies, multiple suppliers, according to the market reality. Can you, let's say, as a rule of thumb, suggest how many lease goes would be required to get optimum value across Europe?
Thibaut, perhaps you'd like to take this one.
Yes. Well, I would start by saying that you should look at it on first of all on a local level. So I think because obviously what we noticed is that larger corporations, yes, they might want one major leasing company all over Europe, but they definitely also want a local runner-up, a local hero. Now, a local hero typically is a local hero. That means that it will be a different hero country by country. So if you look at it in a specific country, we think that depending on the size of your fleet, and that is, of course, different country by country, where a fleet of 1,000 cars, for instance, is a really large fleet in Belgium, while it isn't or it's not that big in France. But depending on the size, I think you should have at least 2 to 3 and even 4 leasing companies. But what you will see is that typically 2 of the 3 leasing companies will take most of the orders during a certain period. And sometimes I noticed that some clients start thinking, well, should we still keep that third one? And suddenly, all of a sudden, it changes, and it's 2 other that takes the lead, and a third one which is a little bit behind. That all depends on the specific strategy of the leasing company itself. So I would say 2 to 3 and 4, but not many more at one point in time. That does not mean, of course, Stephen, that during a period of time you might have more, because the legacy fleet is still including some other suppliers. But mainly focusing active leasing companies, I think 2 to 3, maximum 4 would be a good rhythm.
Okay. There is a question related to the presence that you have today and the slides that you presented. And the question is, let's say, the countries that you have listed in this webinar, are those your own companies or are those franchises?
No, so to be clear, we don't operate a franchise model. TraXall International is a business owned by the leading fleet management companies that are part of TraXall, and these companies, in fact, you'll see some rebranding in the fairly near future, but these companies operate as part of TraXall to the same service standards, the same service charters. Those of you who were in Estoril recently will have seen even some of the international leasing companies start talking about joint venture arrangements to enter new markets. And indeed, that's something we do look at where it's appropriate to do so. So what you have within TraXall is a mix to a certain extent of owned businesses, of joint venture businesses, and we're looking at most cost-effective ways to increase our geographic footprint and to successfully enter new markets. That said, the most important thing to us is our reputation. So what we will not do in any situation is compromise our reputation for service delivery and for client service delivery as well. So whatever we do, however we do it, you will only ever deal in effect with one TraXall organization, and the services will be delivered to the TraXall standard in every single market in which we operate.
Okay. A question related to the internationalization of fleet management. here is an element that is pointed out in the chat function. Don't you think that also international players, if they are fleet management companies, leasing companies, and so on, they also have a strong local presence with local experts and local people that can help fleet managers that have an international strategy to give them the added value also on a local level?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. The international companies work extremely well locally as well. The major challenge is really the challenge around cost, where ultimately, of course, everyone, as I said earlier, has a different opinion in terms of risk strategies, profiles, residual values, profit margins, maintenance budgets, and so on and so on, as well as, of course, specific country objectives that may exist for that particular organization. But in terms of capability, absolutely, the leasing companies, particularly the international ones, are extraordinarily capable, and obviously are there to support, advise, and hopefully win business from international clients. So we see them as extremely strong, placed, or well placed, I should say, within this market, and work with them substantially, actually, on most of the international clients that we have.
Okay. In terms of going further a little bit on the last element that we just detailed, isn't it true that, for example, if you have if you are an international company and you have a big fleet, that you of course can use, let's say, the volume of your fleet in your negotiations with OEMs, with car manufacturers, leasing companies, and so on, and that can give you added value. That at the same time, you can perhaps also set up some kind of SLAs where you can secure towards, let's say, even working in a sole supply, a consistent service quality and a market competitive fee. What is your reaction to that?
Can I take this one, Ross, just for a second?
Yeah, please do, Thibaut.
Just for a second, sir. Yes. Well, again, as we try to point out, it's not only about volumes. It's also about the right structure, the right service, the right way of giving cars to people, and that's different country by country. So it starts there. If in some countries it's not the right way to lease, what can a leasing company then come with volume? I mean, it has no impact. It makes no sense. So the thing is that what we see is that, of course, you can agree upon SLAs about pricing, etc. But even there, what we see is that the local hero often gets more of the quotes than the international partner. So what can you do there? I mean, the best way to do it is keep it also on a local level, and make sure that the international partner is also sharp on the local level, not just on the international level, but also on the local level. That's where the real cost will be, not on the international level. Let's not forget that.
Let me just take that a little bit further, if I may, as well. So, Stephen, you mentioned around sole supply scenarios, and sole supply certainly are great scenarios from the ease of use perspective. And the service delivered, as we've already said, by leasing companies in pretty much any market, whether they're international leasing companies or more local players, is generally very good. The key delta and difference comes down to the price, and there are clearly metrics that people can put into contracts, but what they can't do is really change an organization's view. As an example, let's say today you're paying under a sole supply arrangement €500 a month for whatever car it is you're leasing. If your sole supplier then turns around to you and says, actually, tomorrow that car is now going to be €530 a month on your next order, because you're in a sole supply arrangement, you don't know whether that's realistically a good price in the marketplace. It'll be justified, of course, by the leasing company, whether they're international or a local player, as to something about residual values or something about diesels or a poor experience or whatever it may be. But nevertheless, it's €530, take it or leave it. As an organization and a sole supplier, you have two choices, and that is you either pay the price or you actually unlist that vehicle from your choice and substitute it with perhaps a cheaper vehicle. Now, in a multi-supply scenario, you actually have the ability to look through more than one window at the same time. So you can see what's happening in the market. And you can see, in fact, in multi-supply that whilst leasing company 1 suddenly moved from 500 to 530, leasing company 2 is actually staying at 503, for whatever the reason may be. And immediately, instead of paying a €30 a month increase because leasing company 1, your sole supplier, said that's what you have to pay, you're only paying a €3 per month increase because actually the rest of the market has suddenly taken the lead over leasing company 1. And that's where the value of this competing situation comes in, whether that's internationally, whether that's locally, or whether indeed that's the local representative organization of an international leasing company. This is how it changes, this is how it moves, this is a very fluid marketplace, and regrettably it's going to stay the same and probably get more interesting, as I said earlier on, with Dieselgate.
Okay, the final question is related to your services and let's say the payment. How do you bill? What is the strategy behind that? Because if people are working with you, they also have to pay you a fee.
Yes, they do have to pay as a fee. We are solely client remunerated, so we don't take any money from the leasing industry whatsoever. That's an important distinction. And on that basis, that means that we're acting in the client's interests alone, because actually we have to keep you as a client happy. And obviously we want to work in harmony with leasing companies as well, because it's important to get relationships right at all levels. We don't really see and haven't yet seen a situation where we haven't had at least a 2-to-1 return for any client in terms of a return on investment. So whilst we come with a cost, we actually enable change to happen quicker. We get to the local markets in a way that they understand and help them get on board faster. We have an ability to influence as an extension of your business, your people in a local language from people that they become familiar with and know and trust. So we, in fact, probably cost, I don't know, maybe 2 to 4% maximum of an organization's TCO, but we work damn hard for that 2 to 4%, and the reality is we're effecting a change on the other 96%. So we're a hugely worthwhile investment. Of course, I would say that, but we genuinely deliver substantial returns, and we have obviously a lot of reference points that will support that.
Okay, there is one more question that has popped up here on my screen. Ross, of course, one of the reasons that multinational companies like to work with international leasecos and even go for sole supply is that they can guarantee some compliance to governance standards. How does Trachsel manage governance of local heroes in remote countries?
Stephen, we do the same, in all honesty, so I'm slightly surprised at the question, because corporate governance is clearly a key element from a client perspective. With GDPR and other aspects coming in, it remains very important. But we ensure that that our service delivery meets the requirements set out at the start by each client of ours. So corporate governance is important from a client perspective. We understand that they have corporate governance procedures that they want to see happening. And it's also important from a TraXall perspective, because we also have standards and procedures and processes that we also want to see happening in exactly the same way. Naturally, you get some country by country variations, but that's more about a local market. So we're very focused on corporate governance. It's no different for us as it is any other organization. And the consistency of that is really no different, I would suggest.
And
okay.
If I can add to that, maybe Stephen, just one extra point. Let's not forget that those local heroes, that they're not always small organizations, huh? Often those local heroes are nearly the market leader or the market leader of that country. So they usually also have, they know what to do in that respect. Huh?
Yeah, and one final point from me. Let me just make it clear that where you're talking sole supply arrangements, we manage quite a number of sole supply arrangements for some of our clients. And the reason we're doing that is because actually, perhaps 3 years ago, they were working with Leasing Company 1, but this year, Leasing Company 2 came along and said, hey, we've got a cracking offer for you, sign up here. And of course, it looks an attractive offer going forward, so they make that decision. But the consistency piece is all around the service delivery, and the consistency piece is, from a procurement perspective, you've made a decision to move forward with Leasing Supplier 2. But actually, what you then forget about doing is looking after all the legacy fleets from Leasing Supplier 1 that you've now not going to go forward with, but of course who you may have leasing commitments with for the next 2, 3, 4, even 5 years in some cases. So our job there is really to continue to manage, as we talked about in this webinar, the local distribution, the local management, the local organization, and to make sure there's no flux or disturbance as you implement a new supplier. We just continue to do what we do, which is look after your people and look after your businesses and make sure that everything continues to work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ross and Thibault. Thank you for the insight. We would also like to thank you, the participants, of course. There will be a recorded version of the webinar, and it will be made available online on our website. We will also send you a satisfaction survey because we want to know your feedback and, of course, improve where possible an upcoming webinar. And so we hope that you will have a great end of the year, and we hope to welcome you soon in an upcoming Fleet Europe webinar. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.